And the next case study will be Nick then. I think there's a short technical switch from the Mac world, or rather from the Microsoft world to Mac, or no, you're sticking with that. Great.
Thank you. Yes, just to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Nick Saville is a member of Cambridge English Language Assessment and Assessment Senior Management Team, and he's responsible for directing the work of the Research and Thought Leadership Division. He's the elected Secretary General of the Association of Language Testers in Europe, ALTE, on the Board of Trustees for the International Research Foundation for English Language Education, and a board member of Cambridge University's Institute for Automated Learning and Assessment. Before joining Cambridge, Nick taught at the University of Cagliari in Italy and also worked in Japan. He has a PhD in language assessment, focusing on test impact, an MA in TEFL and a BA in linguistics. Nick publishes widely in the field and has recently completed a volume on learning-oriented assessment with Dr. Neil Jones. He was founding associate editor of Language Assessment Quarterly and is currently joint editor of the Studies in Language Testing series with Professor Cyril Weir. Wow. Over to you, Nick.
That's rather a lot. Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me here. So I'm wearing two hats today, but principally my ALTE hat. But anyone who wants to ask me anything about Cambridge is welcome to do so later if you want to. I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey back in time to the 1990s. And I'm going to take you over to Brussels, because this is work that has come out of the European Union, not the work of the Council of Europe. But it does actually focus on where the CFR has come to play a role across the whole continent in different ways. And I'm particularly looking at some work that we were involved in, and that's Cambridge and also ALTE members, in responding to calls for proposals from the EU to carry out comparability type research. So let's see if this is going to work. It's not working yet because I haven't turned it on. So it should work now. Yeah. So really what we're talking about is the European Union and a policy context to do with language education. And I just put this little motto of the EU up there, united in diversity, because this whole question of setting standards while sustaining diversity is a constant theme, which I think we've already heard a little bit about today. I'd also like to, as I go through, refer you to a wealth of information which you can go away and look up, because I'm only going to have time today to sort of summarize some of this stuff. But some of these documents are actually very rich and have a lot of information. If you haven't yet come across them, it can actually help you to, in a sense, come to terms with what's been going on in a European policy context. I'd like to just refer you to two documents which were commissioned by the European Parliament, by their culture and, what's it called, the Cult Committee it's called. And one of them was actually authored by Valdek, and the one at the top there was authored by myself and a colleague, and we presented this work in the summer. But it actually summarizes a lot of what I'm talking about in one place. But don't forget that the EU is not the Council of Europe, but it can be very confusing because the words used to talk about the EU structures use many of the same words, but in different orders. So you will hear me mention the European Council, which is not the Council of Europe and has nothing to do with Strasbourg. So I'll be referring to the Parliament, the European Council and the Commission, and particularly the Directorate General for Education and Culture in the Commission, which has been responsible for a lot of this work and has commissioned us to do this stuff. And it goes back, the story goes back to the middle of the 1990s, where a white paper was published suggesting that to be a European citizen you needed to know your mother tongue plus 2 other languages, sometimes known as the mother tongue plus 2 policy. These days a little bit sort of out of date as a way of thinking about language skills, but that's the background. And as you come forward, it's related to these meetings of the European Council. So you have the Lisbon Treaty and you have the Barcelona meeting. And in the Barcelona meeting of the European Council, we had what's known as the Barcelona indicators, which are indicators for not academic success, I mean economic development, one of which was the idea of having a language indicator, some way of setting up a benchmark for language education and the language skills of European citizens. So out of the Barcelona meeting, we had the idea, which was elaborated in 2005, of the EILC, the European Indicator on, strangely, on Language Competence. And that led to a call for proposals to run a survey, a European survey on language competences. And this was a survey which was eventually carried out by a consortium of mainly ALTE members who won this tender between 2008 and 2012. I'm just going to summarize that in a second. And then more recently, stop working now. Last year, the second comparability study I'm going to mention, which you may not yet have had a chance to look at, was another call for proposals, which led to a study on the comparability of language testing in Europe, conducted on a very different basis and with a very different timescale, as I'll indicate in a minute. So that's the background. Now, the European survey was actually a massive piece of work conducted over 4 years, which led to some understanding of what levels of proficiency were being achieved in European schooling contexts at age around 16, so after considerable numbers of years of education. This was a survey which referred to the CFR levels. By that time, after 2001, the EU was also working together with the Council of Europe after the first European Day of Languages in promoting the CFR as a tool. It wasn't simply a survey on language ability, but also included a background survey on contextual issues which were supporting or which were driving what was going on. One of the things you have to remember, though, is that every time one of these surveys is set up or has been set up, it's up to the member states to choose whether or not to take part. It sort of comes back to what Jose was saying about, can we mandate things in Europe? And the answer is, in the world of education, the EU is not able to mandate what member states do. It's subject to what is known as subsidiarity, which means that it's the competence of the member states to decide what they want to do. So they use methods of collaboration, such as in Brussels, what's known as the OMC, the Open Method of Coordination, which is a way of exchanging best practice and voluntarily collaborating with others in order to achieve the kind of goals which are being set out. And that idea of subsidiarity also applies to the Council of Europe, and Valde can tell you more about that, or Sarah can. But it means that you can't re-mandate things. So one of the problems with this survey is it didn't have full participation. But it did give us some indication that the levels being achieved in our schools across Europe in foreign languages, in the first and second foreign languages being taught, are not that high. So if you look at this, this is a summary. Then you see that 60% of the participants in this survey, and this was a fully balanced survey of the kind that you might expect from something like PISA. It was a proper sampling frame. So it's representative of the learners. But you see that, you're not... Oh, what's happened? It's you're not getting more than about 40% achieving the B levels, and that's mainly for English. And when it comes to the second foreign language, even lower. And when you look at how that is spread, you can see if you... this is quite a complex chart, but these were the countries that took part, going down, and those were the levels being achieved. So the darker blue are the kind of B levels, and the yellow are like pre-A1. So what's the country at the bottom there? Soon no longer to be a member of the EU, and we'll lead to less embarrassment when we move. And then, perhaps not surprisingly, some of the countries known for being better at languages are at the top, but still not amazingly fantastic. And this was for the first foreign language, and when you actually put the second foreign language in, Sweden fell right to the bottom, which was the interesting point, that they were achieving very well in English, but not necessarily in a more plurilinguistic way. But this is, still quite a blunt instrument. What was this? What were the benefits of this survey? Well, it was a massive piece of work, and it did provide some what you might call hard evidence, because the survey was rigorous, the testing was rigorous, and the data collected was incredibly well. In a sense, it was prepared extremely well in order to reach the conclusions we got to. There were limitations because only 14 countries, 16 jurisdictions took part, so can't be considered totally representative of Europe. It was only 2 languages per country, and of course many, as we've just heard, many places teach more than just 2. Perhaps where many people were very disappointed is that it covered 3 skills, but the one which it didn't cover, and this was part of the tender, was speaking. And it sort of implied that you could apply this survey, like all of these surveys, like PISA, willy-nilly across all parts of the world, and it will give you the same kind of comparability data. And perhaps not, therefore, dealing with the diversity in Europe adequately. It did lead, when looking at the questionnaire data, the contextual information along with the performance data, you could come up with some fairly intuitive conclusions where things were working better and where they were working less well. And here's a sentence which you can read yourself in red. Language is learnt better where motivation is high, where learners perceive it to be useful, and where it's indeed used outside of school. So the point being that actually schooling, 3 hours a week, isn't really the ideal, adequate context for reaching the higher levels. But perhaps you didn't need a survey to tell you that. But it did reiterate, though, back to the Commission that we need to do more. There is a lot of potential to do more, but that perhaps the survey model wasn't really dealing with the complexity adequately and was missing something in the way that it was applying the survey model, the sort of PISA model, to language learning, and it wasn't really digging down into the contextual variables adequately to really reveal what was working and what wasn't working. So that was the outcome, and that went back into the mix. That was in 2012. It was presented at the European Day of Languages in Cyprus in 2012. And then the Commission went back to think about how to take this forward. And I think at that time they were thinking about Survey Mark II, and was part of what they called their Rethinking Education at that time as part of the ongoing multilingualism projects. But then in 2014, the Commission took the proposal to the Council, which is the heads of state and government, and said, we'd like to do another survey. And basically they said, we're fed up with surveys. Too many surveys, we don't want another one, waste of money. And by the way, why don't you just use the information that you've already got? Because everybody in Europe has tests. Just compare those and you'll be okay, because you'll be able to then use the existing data to reach your conclusions and decide where your benchmark's going to be. So they invited the Commission to assess the feasibility, to start with, of using national test data to monitor progress towards the goal, the Mother Tongue +2. They did say some sensible things, like why don't you strengthen your cooperation that's already good with the Council of Europe, particularly ECML, so Relang is an example of that, if you like. And they said, well, since we can't mandate what you have to do, carry on using this open method of coordination to exchange best practice and enhance the effectiveness of what goes on in that way. Okay, so that then led to three things going on. One of which was a tender to carry out this thing called the Study on Comparative Language Testing in Europe, which is what, in this case, Cambridge attended for and won. And I'll come on and tell you about that. But there were two other pieces of work that they commissioned. One was by the Eurydice Network to conduct an review of national tests in Europe. And that report exists since 2015. And they also worked with CREL. Are you familiar with CREL? The Centre for Research on Education and Lifelong Learning, to conduct a study on language and employability. So there was three pieces of work which came out of this follow-up to that 2014 council. Now this is the one that we did, and I won't be able to go into much detail, but it's available online. You just Google this, Study on Comparative Language Testing in Europe, and you can get the full report. It's, as it says, I already mentioned it, can we use the existing data, and what might come out of it if we did? Could we bring forward looking at some proposals for developing in positive ways existing tests and make them more comparable, or for those who are currently not using assessment as tests, I mean perhaps more school-based, could you come out with other ways in which you could generate data for comparability? This is what we're asked to do, because again they were looking for some kind of league table, which of course, I'll tell you now, we weren't able to produce in the time frame we were given. So that's it, goals. Use existing tests. But here's the problem. What we had to do was to compare the existing language tests in all 28 EU member states at the two levels, the lower and upper secondary, ISCED 2 and 3, for the languages which were taught and tested in significant numbers. So English most of the time, but that would also include in many cases French, German, and sometimes another language. So think of all the variables there that you might be wanting to compare. And they were very, very demanding of what they wanted us to do. 5 tasks, which each one of them might take 4 years to do. These are all 4. I'll come on to them in a minute. And here is the time frame. We won the tender in April 2015, and we had to deliver the final report at the beginning of September. And that's not fun. But forget everything. But in between, you had to be reporting back monthly on what was going on. Within an organizational structure was like this. We set up a way of doing it, which included a structure in Cambridge, in order to conduct, mainly the methodology was using content analysis of the kind that, the sort of CFR grid type stuff. And then we were experimented with a method called the comparative judgment method, which is very interesting. And if you want to read about it, there's a summary of how it works in the final report. But I won't go into that today. We were reporting to the indicator expert group on multilingualism, which is all of the member states have an expert which they assign to DG EAC as their representative. And so those are the people we were talking to, who were partly responsible for helping us get the materials to evaluate. But there's the rub. If they didn't feel like doing it, we had to do it even though they weren't able to give us the information. That's what the contract required. So getting the data, getting the information in order to do any comparisons, and getting it in a form which you might be able to use to make comparisons highlights one of the problems, and why actually this method, this shows actually the potential for doing it. It's like a pilot study, but it isn't a way of doing it, not in that time frame or in that way. We eventually managed to get hold of 133 exams, often with multiple papers in it, in order to carry out the comparison, and across those languages where there was significant teaching going on. So quite a big data set. The qualitative data was actually looking at trying to come up with a framework for judging these things. Importantly, we were using the Common European Framework. The quantitative data was the comparative judgment method, which I won't go into. Basically, as you go through all of this, we were able to come up with some recommendations, but we couldn't say that currently you could use existing data. One of the reasons was that there wasn't enough commonality. Neither the way in which people test or the quality of the exams which they use to justify that comparison. Actually, much of the time there was no data on the quality of the exams at all. And we had hoped to get hold of speaking and writing, and even when people claimed to be doing it and collecting data, you couldn't get hold of it. So the conclusion is, the study showed how the approach could be used, but you'd have to address this question, A, of the nature of the data, and B, the quality of the exams. Otherwise, the comparison will be meaningless. So, but at the Day of Languages last year, here's what the EU concluded in their summing up of our report: better understanding and use of the CFR within national education systems will be helpful. Now, hang on. Wasn't that why you had the CFR in the first place? Going back to the beginning, we went back to 1991. We are suggesting that we need to think more at the level of how exams interact with learning and teaching. So as we've heard, learning-oriented aspects of assessment, and how we can develop learning skills, not just outcome measures, because don't forget that learning a language on a lifelong basis, that's where you want the skills to be developed in schooling for the future. And one of the big things, of course, which the EU has been concentrating on in their current program is the Erasmus+, which has this online linguistic support tool, which is proving quite successful. So there's the full report there. Those are the reports I referred to later. You can ask me about it if you want. And here we are. Flourishing diversity.
Right, thank you very much, and thanks for the reference to learner autonomy, learning skills, etc. Still a bit of time for questions, so if I could invite, yep. I was just going to say, maybe now someone from this side, so spot on, thanks.
Thanks. I would just like to ask you, I think this is very interesting, if you took into consideration that students start learning second language at different ages, very different ages, I think.
In the survey lang, then that would have come out in the data, or in the cases where they were learning it younger, it would be part of the contextual information. But that's just one of the things that is part of the rich diversity. It's what are you comparing, and under what circumstances have people got to the point they're at the ISCED 3 and ISCED 2 levels. And I think the survey model showed how you could do it systematically, unlike the comparability study, which was rather ad hoc, depending on what you got hold of. But the survey model was very quantitative in the way that it approached things. And we had been suggesting, various of us, that if you wanted to repeat the survey, you might like to back up the testing with other forms of contextual analysis other than simply looking at questionnaires. So more like case studies to investigate, more like what we've been seeing with Relang, where you actually try and get a much richer mixed method picture of what goes on in the teaching and learning context in order to explain the outcome measures better. As if we don't think there's a kind of a linear relationship between what goes on in the school and whether the higher levels are being achieved. There are much more contextual societal factors, such as like the Swedish example demonstrates it. If you go to Sweden, it's a part of the world where you can walk out in the street and speak English, right? It's not the case in many parts of Europe, where you have to you have to use the local language. That's good, but if you're trying to teach English, you have to, or French or German, whatever, the learners have to see it beyond what goes on in the classroom. I think that's one of the key points.
Nick, I fully support your plea for continuing this study of the comparability of language testing. I think this is very important. Yet I just wonder, you complain that you had so little time, etc. I wonder what the level of reading comprehension at Cambridge is. I mean, it was in the terms of reference, in fact, that it could only take 6 months or so. Why didn't you protest and say, look, we can't do this in this very short time?
It's like, the answer is then you don't do it, right? I think my preference is to engage with it and then show them what you can do in 6 months. And to come up with, we did come up with an outcome. Actually, it's quite an interesting outcome. It may not be the outcome that they wanted, or it may be the outcome they wanted, actually. I think the people in the commission were quite happy to show the politicians that it isn't possible to do it, right? So it's gone back into the politicians' court now. Well, if you want a benchmark, do you want a benchmark? How are you going to get it? Because at the moment, although it's a good idea, what you said, we knew in advance it wasn't going to work because, funnily enough, that's why the CFR was invented 25 years ago, to address this question.
Also goes to show that the ECML supported projects focus more on sustainability and they give project partners time to develop an idea and follow up on it, just as the Germans say, breaking the lance for the ECML. Any further questions?
Yes, just one question at the end. You very briefly referred to this online linguistic tool used in Erasmus+. Maybe you could say a little bit more about it. Is this tool adjusted or linked to the CFR, and how what kind of success do you see in this tool?
Not my area of expertise. All I would say is that working with the people in the multilingualism unit, they are now fully wedded to using the CFR, and that was their conclusion about making more use of it. So this is actually very positive on one level. Erasmus Plus has its own placement test now, so that if you go on a Erasmus scheme, you take a pre and post test using this online testing tool. It is supposedly calibrated to the CFR. In fact, I met some of the people who were working on that who came to an ALTE meeting in Finland last month in order to find out more about how ALTE goes about quality assuring the claims that you make if you make a claim that your assessment is linked to the CFR. So I think they're trying to do the right thing, and progress is made. And Valdek can tell you that the amount of work that has gone on in multilingualism is an, if you like, a secret which most people don't know. So when you look at the reports that came out that we did for the CULT committee, there's a huge amount going on with actually quite little resource these days in the centre. Although Erasmus Plus is a multi-billion euro project over 7 years, quite a lot is being done, like Relang and other things, with relatively limited resources. And of course, in its heyday, the Commission had a commissioner for multilingualism 10 years ago. Gradually, multilingualism and linguistic issues have become what they call transversal. That is, there's no one central place where they go on. That it's supposed to be everywhere. You know, language is central to just about everything you do, whether it's education or integration or employment or whatever it is. But the risk is that it gets hidden by not having a champion at the sort of commissioner level.
Right, thank you very much. I can only recommend reading the report. I read it in preparation for this seminar because it was sent to us to prepare for this. So it's interesting reading, and considering the time constraints, etc., all the more impressive. So thank you very much, Nick. Thanks.